did we go from this to this? How did we go from sailing ships to modern steel vessels? The transition from sail to steel wasn't an easy one. It took decades for the first steel ships to be commercially viable, and even longer for them to become the standard. But why was the switch made? What were the benefits of steel over wood? And what was life like on a steel ship versus a wooden one? Well, let's start with the obvious. Wood is flammable and steel isn't. While there were ways to make wooden ships more fire-resistant, such as coating them in a thick layer of tar, they could still catch fire and burn just as intensely as any other wooden structure. Steel ships, on the other hand, were much more resistant to fire. In fact, they could even withstand explosions on board without sinking. Of course, this didn't make them invincible, but it certainly helped. During the Crimean War, for instance, British wooden ships would often ignite when struck by Russian cannon fire. This wasn't a problem for the French, though, since they had built several steel warships by that point. But the advantages of steel went beyond just fire resistant. They were also stronger and more durable, meaning they require less maintenance. Another advantage was that steel ships were faster and more maneuverable than wooden ones. This was because steel was denser and more rigid, which made it easier to shape into a streamlined hull. It also meant that steel ships could carry more cargo or passengers without becoming overloaded. The drawbacks of steel, however, were that it was more expensive to build and repair, and it was heavier, which meant that ships would have to be reinforced to compensate. Despite these disadvantages, steel quickly became the preferred material for shipbuilding once people realized its potential. The very first commercially viable steel ship was the English warship, HMS Warrior, which was launched in 1860. She was a screw frigate, meaning that she had both sails and a steam engine. This was a common way to convert existing wooden ships into steel ones. Simply add a steam engine and boiler. You've got yourself a modern warship. But this was not always the best solution, since the addition of the engine room and boiler often left little space for anything else, which made these ships top-heavy and By the 1870s, though, shipbuilders had learned how to construct all-steel vessels. One of the first was a French cruiser, launched in 1867. She was followed by many others of her class, all of which were fast, maneuverable, and cheap to operate. Life on a steel ship was very different from life on a wooden one. For one thing, there was no comparison in terms of comfort. Wooden ships were notoriously uncomfortable places to work and live. The constant rocking and rolling, the cramped quarters, and the lack of sanitation made them a breeding ground for disease. Steel ships, on the other hand, were much more stable and could be built to be more comfortable. They also had better ventilation and more spacious living quarters for the crew. Another difference was the amount of work required to maintain the vessel. Wooden ships required constant upkeep. The wood had to be painted or coated and tired to prevent it from rotting. The masts and rigging had to be inspected and repaired regularly. Steel ships, on the other hand, were much easier to maintain. A coat of paint was all that was really needed to keep them in good condition. This meant that steel ships could stay at sea for longer periods of time without needing a shipyard, which was a huge advantage for the navies of the world. Of course, life on a steel ship wasn't all sunshine and roses. There were still problems to be solved, such as the buildup of rust and the tendency of steel to fracture under stress. But overall, steel ships were a definite improvement over wooden ones. As the years went on, steel ships became more and more popular. By the turn of the century, most new vessels being built was steel. And by mid-century, almost every navy in the world had converted to steel ships. The only holdouts were the navies of a few small countries who either couldn't afford to replace their wooden ships or didn't have enough steel to build new ones. Today, steel is the dominant material used in ships. It's strong, durable, and cheap, which is why it's so popular. However, there are some drawbacks to using steel. For one thing, it's not very eco-friendly. Steel production is a major polluter and steel ships are difficult to recycle. These drawbacks have led some people to call for a return to wooden ships, which are more environmentally friendly and easier to repair. But this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. Steel is simply too cheap and effective a material to be replaced. I hope you enjoyed learning about the evolution of ships from sail to steel. If you did, please subscribe and leave a like. Thanks for watching.